When we picture public corruption, we usually imagine envelopes of cash and backroom deals, direct financial transactions meant to buy influence. But in high-stakes public infrastructure projects, overt bribery is increasingly obsolete. It leaves too obvious a paper trail. Instead, modern misconduct takes a different form, known as policy corruption. This evolution is highly effective because the manipulation is embedded directly into the formal, legal rules of the procurement process. It makes the corruption entirely invisible to standard audits. To see exactly how this operates in practice, we can look at recent empirical data analyzing public architectural procurement in Thailand. The primary instrument governing these public projects is a document called the Terms of Reference, or TOR. Formally, a TOR is an administrative tool designed to establish objective project specifications and guarantee fair market competition among architectural firms. The empirical reality, however, shows that procurement officials often strategically draft these documents to bypass that exact competition. By tailoring the document's requirements, officials can handpick specific winning firms without ever technically violating administrative law. Manipulating a TOR is therefore not an administrative oversight. It is a highly effective, legally compliant method for rigging systemic procurement. This diagram illustrates the governance, risk, and compliance framework. We need this theoretical baseline to understand exactly how procurement integrity is compromised. To fully map the problem, this framework intersects with the COSO Enterprise Risk Management Model, which accounts for deeply ingrained organizational culture and ethical behavior. We can isolate the three specific pillars of this matrix to see how they actively fail under pressure. Structural corruption never relies on a single point of failure. It requires simultaneous manipulation across all three of these overlapping nodes. If we isolate the governance node, we can examine the limits and abuses of administrative discretion. This reveals the first empirical mechanism identified in the Thailand study, restrictive eligibility criteria written directly into the TOR. Officials mandate highly specific, narrowly defined past project experience that only a handful of pre-selected, favored firms possess. The immediate consequence is severe. It effectively locks out independent, highly qualified, and younger architectural professionals from even submitting a bid. These eligibility requirements act as structural barriers that consolidate market power among a few favored firms. Shifting focus to the risk node allows us to examine how financial baselines are established and manipulated. Here we find the second empirical mechanism, opaque cost estimation practices embedded in the procurement process. Procurement officials routinely derive baseline project budgets directly from unverified vendor-submitted data sheets. By bypassing independent audits, these baseline costs are artificially inflated before the bidding phase even opens. Failing to verify this data normalizes unmanaged risk, making systemic cost inflation a protected standard operating procedure. Finally, we turn to the compliance node to examine the mechanisms of public oversight. This reveals the third empirical mechanism, the execution of entirely superficial public consultation processes. Public hearings for these infrastructure projects are legally mandated, properly scheduled, and formally held. Yet, despite notes being taken, community input never actually alters the predetermined TOR document. This creates a dangerous facade. Strict procedural compliance provides legal cover, but it fails to deliver any actual public accountability. Right in the dead center of this framework, we find the resulting zone of structural policy corruption. This is the cumulative effect of restrictive eligibility, opaque costing, and superficial consultation operating in unison. This environment systematically excludes independent architects from public projects, rendering their hard-earned licenses and professional experience entirely irrelevant. The systematic exclusion of architects creates an ethical crisis, decoupling the profession from its core responsibility to deliver inclusive public interest design. Policy corruption actively severs architects from their core ethical mandate, which is to deliver sustainable, inclusive public interest design to their communities. Procedural tweaks like symbolic meetings fail to reach the institutional roots of policy corruption. The first and most critical systemic reform required to combat this is the full integration of securely digitally enabled e-procurement ecosystems. Advanced platforms like Singapore's GBiz eliminate administrative discretion by automating real-time audit trails of any modifications made to the TOR. The second necessary reform focuses on the institutional evolution of professional architectural bodies. State policy must expand the legal mandate of organizations like Thailand's Council of Architects. Currently, these organizations act passively as mere licensing and disciplinary boards. They must take on an active role as a rigorous institutional procurement auditors. Restoring true procurement integrity requires society to empower architectural professionals, not just as designers, but as active governance actors who fiercely defend public value.